Chapter 4. Is it ever appropriate to reveal humiliating or harmful information about another? You shall not stand by while your brother's blood is shed. Jewish law compares spreading humiliating or harmful information to shedding blood, an act that is normally wrong, though not always. For example, killing in self-defense. One specific case in which you are permitted to transmit negative truths is when you are asked for a business or job reference. As the Hafez Haim, the Eastern European rabbinic sage who was Judaism's preeminent authority on the laws of permitted and forbidden speech, teaches, if a person wants to take someone into his affairs, for example, to hire him in his business or go into partnership with him, it is permitted for him to go around and ask and inquire from others so as to prevent possible loss to himself, and it is permissible for others to reveal even very derogatory information, since the intent is not to harm the prospective employee, but to tell the truth in order to save one's fellow human being from potential harm. Similarly, Jewish law insists that you speak frankly when someone requests your opinion about a prospective employee whom you know to be dishonest or incompetent. Another instance in which revealing negative information is permitted is when someone is romantically involved with a person whom you know to be inappropriate or who is concealing information to which the partner is entitled. In an important overview of Jewish perspectives on privacy, the Jewish legal scholar Rabbi Alfred Cohen tells of a young man whose friend was seriously dating his neighbor. The man knew that his friend had a serious health problem, and he realized from conversations with the young woman that she was unaware of his condition. He asked Rabbi Cohen whether he should disclose this fact or whether this would constitute a violation of Judaism's laws forbidding gossip. The rabbi ruled that Jewish law obliged the young man to pass on this information to the woman, since she had the right to know about her boyfriend's medical condition before deciding whether or not to marry him. But, Rabbi Cohen noted, there is no clear-cut moral or legal guideline about when to transmit such information. If the man went around telling every woman whom his friend dated about his illness, his friend's social life would be ruined, as would their friendship. On the other hand, a woman who learns such information after she has gotten to know the man's more positive aspects will be in a far better position to judge the illness's significance for herself. Morally, the best course would be for the young man to emphasize to his friend that he has a moral obligation to inform his partner himself, and that if he doesn't do so, he, the friend, will feel obliged to do so. Only in a case where someone won't give their romantic partner important information and the relationship is clearly serious should another person convey this information to the partner. Presumably, the same advice would apply if you knew that a person had been unfaithful in a previous marriage, possessed a very bad temper, or was verbally or physically violent. This is information to which a would-be spouse is entitled. Even in instances when you're permitted to share negative information, you should only reveal that which is relevant. Thus, if somebody inquires whether would make a suitable business partner, you may indeed should say that cheated a previous partner or came to work every day at 11 in the morning in a previous job and went home at 3 in the afternoon. You should not, however, dredge up a fascinating but irrelevant scandal involving B's marriage. When disclosing negative information, you should tell precisely what you know and nothing more. If you exaggerate, you are guilty of slander. In such case, it would be morally preferable to say nothing at all. You also should not disseminate embarrassing or negative information about a person to anyone besides those who need it. Otherwise, moral people frequently violate this principle. They try to justify spreading negative news to large numbers of people by claiming that some who hear it might need it in the future. For example, everyone needs to know the reason a person's marriage broke up, since someone who hears the story might someday date him or her. Occasionally, it is morally appropriate to share negative information with many people. For example, if a political candidate has misused his office for personal profit, or a physician is engaging in treatments that are harmful to patients, or an employer has sexually harassed his employees. In such cases, there may be many people who need this information to vote against the dishonest politician, to avoid the unscrupulous doctor, or to avoid working for the abusive boss. Follow this guiding principle for disseminating negative information. Will the information's recipient suffer from a clear and present danger? It certainly need not be a life-threatening one if he or she doesn't possess these facts. As noted in Chapter 2, if you are uncertain about the veracity of what you are passing along, then you must say so. In such a case, you are permitted to warn an inquiring would-be business partner, employer, employee, or potential mate to look into a specific matter, but you must explain that this information is either what you heard said, including why you think it might be credible, or something that you suspect. In the latter case, you must explain your suspicions and give the other person a chance to assess your reasoning, which he or she may find filmed. A simple guideline: if you would not be prepared to swear under oath that a story is true, don't present it as undeniably true. Should confidences ever be broken? What about deep, dark secrets confided to a cleric or a psychiatrist? Is it ever appropriate to reveal them? Here the ethical standards of the world and of different religions vary. Consider an elementary or high school psychologist who learns that a student is using illegal drugs. Should the psychologist inform the child's parents? Over the years, I have posed this question before dozens of audiences. I have generally found that a large majority of listeners feel that the parents should be informed. Since they know that I am a rabbi, when I ask them what they think Jewish law would rule, an even larger majority express the conviction that it would insist that the parents be informed. In fact, it is likely that Jewish law would take the opposite. As Rabbi Alfred Cohen argues, involving the parents might ultimately prove beneficial to the child, but the disclosure of confidential information might effectively stop other students from confiding in that psychologist and thereby prevent their being treated at all. Furthermore, if psychologists could not be trusted to maintain silence, people in general would stop using them. So the question really is, do psychologists benefit society as a whole? Will divulging secrets endanger the practice of that profession? What would be the net result to society if troubled persons no longer had someone to help them cope with personal problems? This is a perfect example of the moral difficulties that ensue when an individual good clashes with a societal good. In this case, the rabbi suggests that the larger good of society constitutes a higher value than the possible benefit to one individual. On the other hand, if the psychologist had good reason to believe that the boy's survival depended on his parents knowing certain information, as in the case of a child contemplating suicide, ethics would dictate a different ruling. Consider the tragic case of Tatiana Tarasov, University of California, Berkeley student who was murdered by a man named Prosenjit Poddar because she had rebuffed his romantic advances. After his arrest, it was revealed that Poddar had confided to his university-affiliated psychologist his intention to kill Tarasov when she returned from her summer vacation. The psychologist had taken Poddar's threats so seriously that he informed campus police, who in turn detained Poddar for questioning. However, they released him when he appeared to be acting rationally. At that point, the psychologist's supervisor, also a psychologist, directed him to desist from further action regarding the case. As a result, Poddar's psychologist never contacted Tarasov to warn her about the danger. Unaware of what Poddar had confided to his psychologist, the Tarasov family maintained a cordial relationship with the spurned suitor. Poddar even persuaded Tarasov's brother to share an apartment with him, and thus was in a position to learn when she returned from her vacation at which time he murdered her. Tarasov's parents successfully sued the two university psychologists, as well as the University of California, for concealing this life-threatening information from the people most in need of it, their daughter. The majority of judges ruled that while doctor-patient confidentiality normally must be safeguarded, this privileged relationship should be breached when it puts an innocent person in serious danger. At even so commonsensical a conclusion provoked the ire of dissenting Justice William Clark, who argued that the doctor had acted appropriately in not contacting Tarasov. Because of the majority ruling, he maintained patients henceforth would fear that information confided to therapists, including threats, might be disclosed, and thus treatment of the mentally ill would be greatly impaired.
Even if one rejects Justice Clark's premise, as I do, that it is preferable to sometimes let an innocent person die rather than violate a patient's confidence, the majority ruling in the Tarasov case still leaves an open question. How can we reconcile our need, and societies, to have outlets for unacceptable feelings with the need to protect the objects of those feelings? Since many people confide fantasies of violence against other people to their therapists, when should a mental health professional disclose these threats to a potential victim and to the police? Always disclosing threats would hardly be realistic or desirable. Many, if not most, of us have probably exclaimed at some point in our lives, "I could kill him. I really could." It is usually perfectly clear to both the listener and speaker that the threat is not intended serious. So if a therapist has strong reason to believe that the patient is just venting his feelings, then clearly the patient-therapist's confidence should not be broken. It would be very different, however, if a patient spoke to a therapist, for example, about shooting up school, which has happened often in the United States, with fatal consequence. In such a case, we would want the therapist, and not just a therapist, but anyone else privy to such information, to go to the proper authorities and tell them about this person who might well be a walking time bomb. Does this guideline place an unfair burden on the therapist, forcing her to decide case by case whether a threat is seriously intended? In truth, this guideline does place a difficult responsibility on the therapist. Perhaps the therapist's best way to assess such threats is to personalize them, to imagine that the violent sentiments are directed toward him or herself or toward a loved one. If the therapist feels no trepidation about the threat, then it is very likely, though not certainly, inconsequential. On the other hand, if the therapist feels fearful when personalizing the threat, knowing that she would tell her spouse and children, "If you ever see this person come to the house, don't let him in," she should be morally obliged to inform the potential victim and the authorities. If personalizing a threat makes it seem more potent to the therapist, so be it. If an error must be made, better it should be made in the direction of saving an innocent life rather than safeguarding a would-be murderer's privacy. The doctor should also ask himself what he would do if a patient speaks of committing suicide and the threat seems to be serious. Would he break the rules of confidentiality and tell members of the patient's family or any other relevant person in order to protect the patient? And if he would, then should he not, by the same token, warn people whom the patient might harm? Are the ethics different in the case of clergy-client confidentiality? For example, there is a well-known Catholic canon law that prohibits revelations of any statements made in confession, even when a life is at stake. Not surprisingly, so uncompromising a position can lead to great moral difficulties. In Alfred Hitchcock's classic film I Confess, a man confesses to priests that he murdered someone, then plants circumstantial evidence implicating the cleric. Although the priest is aware of the killer's identity, he finds himself forbidden to disclose it to the police, even after he becomes the prime suspect, and even after an innocent woman's reputation is destroyed during a thorough and somewhat mean-spirited police investigation. A similar dilemma lies at the heart of Father William Kienzle's best-selling murder mystery, The Rosary Murders. Here a serial killer confesses his crime to a priest and tells him the reason for his actions. Unlike his counterpart in I Confess, the priest doesn't know the anonymous confessor's identity. But he too acknowledges and accepts that Catholic law prohibits him from informing the police about the confession or any details he learned during it, lest this information enable them to identify the killer. After painful soul-searching, the thought of innocent people dying bothers him terribly. He concludes, should protecting the seal of confession cost a priest his life, or another innocent life, no reason was sufficient, no cause important enough to violate that seal. In the novel, the priest ends up solving the murder himself. Jewish law is far less categorical. A case that tested the principle of rabbi-client confidentiality occurred in New York some years ago. A short time after a married woman was murdered, her husband sought out a prominent rabbinic scholar and confessed to being haunted by his wife's death, though he was unsure whether the murder in his mind was a real memory or a dream. During the meeting, it became clear to the rabbi that the man was speaking about himself. Afterward, the rabbi went to the police. Their investigation revealed that the husband, who was deeply in debt, had taken out a large life insurance policy on his wife shortly before she was murdered. After the man was arrested, the rabbi testified as a prosecution witness at his trial, and the man was convicted of the murder of his wife. At the time, some members of the Jewish community felt that the rabbi had acted unjustly. They felt that, at the very least, he should have informed the killer that his disclosures would not be held in confidence. This objection seems unreasonable, given the husband's violent nature and the rabbi's natural fear of the harm the man might do to protect his terrible secret. Then, too, an important biblical principle states, "Do not stand by while your neighbor's blood is shed," which Jewish law understands as a neighbor's blood is shed, which Jewish law understands as mandate not to withhold help or information that could be of life and death significance to another person. Important as confidentiality is, it is a less compelling value than saving a person's life and or bringing a killer to justice and making sure that the killer can never kill again. While people generally have the right to expect a doctor, psychologist, clergyperson, or lawyer to safeguard their secrets, this right, at least as I understand it, should be cancelled when a higher good, the protection of innocent life, is at stake.
Chapter 5: Privacy and Public Figures. So far, we have discussed the rights of ordinary people to have their privacy respected. But what about public figures, especially those we have entrusted with the power to lead us? Are they a special case, or do we have the same ethical obligations toward them? Any journalists consider public figures to be a special case. As the late Howard Simons, a managing editor of the Washington Post and a prominent proponent of this view, put it, "I don't believe any politician in the United States ought to have a private life. Those who share this view argue that any activity in which a person engages can reveal significant information about his or her character. Thus, the voting public has the right to know it all." This belief is now so ingrained in the American psyche that many people rarely question, on either moral or practical grounds, the assertion that anyone who enters public life loses the right to protect himself from all public scrutiny. Yet is it moral to deny any human being, including a public official, a sphere of privacy in which she can act without fear that her actions will be reported to large numbers of people? The answer is no. It is morally unjustifiable, at least as I understand it, to deny public officials a private life. As the professor of philosophy David Nyberg writes in The Varnished Truth, "A life without privacy is unthinkable. How could we make love, reflect or meditate, write a poem, keep a diary, attend to those sometimes highly self-conscious requirements of skin and bowels? Civility itself requires privacy. But don't such no-holds-barred investigations lead voters to select better qualified, more ethical candidates? Isn't the evil of even intrusive snooping outweighed by a greater good?" Again, I would answer no. 40 years of muckraking, much of it centered on candidates' private lives, does not seem to have led to the election of more capable or more honest people. Asterisk indeed, one of the primary achievements of this muckraking has been to make Americans more cynical and less trusting than ever of their elected leaders. 3. It has also, as shall be discussed, caused no shortage of sensitive and highly ethical people to shy away from entering public life. One feature of what the political scientist Larry Sabato labels attack journalism is extensive coverage of public figures' sexual indiscretions and misbehaviors, a subject that arises the greatest amount of popular and journalistic obsession. For yet no evidence suggests that presidents or other public officials and opinion makers who have engaged in extramarital affairs have proven less effective or, more important, less trustworthy than those who have not. Americans have paid a steep price for the media's ongoing obsession with sexual gossip. Most important, it has caused media attention to focus on personal rather than substantive issues. Reporter Stephen Roberts has observed that more ink was devoted in the 1970s to Congressman Wilbur Mills' exploits with Fan F, a stripper with whom the congressman had had an affair, than to Wilbur Mills writing half the tax laws on the books. As that serve the readers and make sense, not to me. While Roberts is correct that this focus on the personal makes no logical sense, The reason for the media's skewed priorities is clear to anyone who understands human nature. People are more interested in erotic matters than they are in substantive issues. Ask most voters to prioritize a set of issues in terms of the national interest, and sexual behavior will rank near the bottom. Announce, however, that a television program investigating a candidate's love life, including problematic relationships and potential scandals, will be broadcast at the same time as a program discussing the candidate's positions on some of the most pressing issues facing America, including economic and security issues. And which program do you think will attract more viewers? The question is rhetorical, and not because viewers have deluded themselves into thinking that this topic is more important, but because it interests them more. Most of us are very interested in others' failings, particularly their sexual peccadillos. Even when we acknowledge that such curiosity is intrusive, uncouth, and even immoral, it is difficult to suppress it. If you were in a friend's house, walked into the bedroom, found your friend's diary open, and saw the words, "I had sex yesterday," would you have the moral strength and character to close the diary? Early in the 1988 presidential campaign, the Miami Herald reported that there was strong circumstantial evidence that a senator who was a leading contender for a major party nomination was having a sexual affair, and he was forced to withdraw from the race. I am not mentioning either the man's or the woman's name, as both of them have suffered greatly for their behavior and are, I suspect, happy to be out of the public eye. The case received a tremendous amount of publicity at the time, and over the years I have asked dozens of audiences, how many of you think that the public had the right to know about this relationship and presumed affair? Regularly, between 10 and 20% say yes, the public had the right to know, while well over 60% say no. I address my next question only to the no majority. As an outgrowth of your belief that the public had no right to this knowledge, how many of you refused to read articles about the supposed affair and turned off your television sets when it was announced that pictures were now going to be shown of the woman with whom the candidate had his relationship? Almost everyone laughs at this question, and at most, one or two hands go up. Those who believe that the public had no moral right to know about this presumed affair, but who followed the case avidly, are not hypocrites. They are human beings with normal human interests. Almost all negative gossip, particularly about sex, is so inherently interesting that it is very hard to ignore. To draw an analogy, most married Americans believe in monogamy. But if every time they checked into a hotel, a very attractive person were waiting for them in their room, many confirm monogamists would commit adultery. Mercifully, few of us are presented with such temptations. Perhaps the most unfortunate repercussion of the media's obsession with the private lives of public figures is that it has caused Americans to pay less attention to far more substantive and significant issues. In addition to criminal acts, such as sexual offenses, accepting bribes, embezzling funds, and the like, the chief offense for which public officials deserve to be called to account is hypocrisy. For example, does the person engage in conduct he denounces or wishes to see punished in others? If not, then great caution is advised. A few years back, a friend of mine whose husband holds a high public office called me for advice about an ethical dilemma. She and her husband had learned that a prominent adversary of her husband's political party once conducted an adulterous affair. His mistress had become pregnant, and the man urged her to have an abortion. She did, and he paid for it. Both of us knew that revealing such information would definitely end the man's political career, given that he had carefully cultivated an image of great moral rectitude. I asked my friend only one question. Did this man currently oppose the right of women to have abortions? If yes, his hypocrisy in arranging an abortion when it suited his interests would be so clear that it seemed to me that this information should be released. But if he supported a woman's right to have an abortion, I believe that outing him for having committed adultery would be immoral. The man's relationship with his wife was intact, and the woman with whom he had an affair had gone on with her life. and it was only by the strangest of coincidences that this information had come into my friend's hand. My friend acknowledged that the adversary supported abortion rights, but cited other political stances with which she disagreed, positions on which I concurred with her. However, I maintain that it would be indefensible to reveal his infidelity and the abortion. Much as we may dislike somebody, to dig up and disseminate whatever dirt we can to destroy him or her would still be wrong. Of course, everything I have written about until now involves consensual relations. It does not apply to someone who uses their position of authority to pressure a person into sexual relations, particularly a person dependent on them for employment. For example, Harvey Weinstein, one of Hollywood's most successful and acclaimed producers, engaged in crude, vile, and most likely criminal behavior, and also apparently harmed the careers of some of the actresses who refused his sexual demands. A person who engages in such behavior puts himself outside the protection of the laws of Lashon Hara. Pretty much anyone around him, and certainly women who have dealings with him, are at risk and have the right to be forewarned. But aside from instances like these, public figures should not be exempt from the right to privacy that we all enjoy, except for those aspects of their lives that relate to job performance. They should be able to keep their private lives private. Ironically, the obsession with invading our leaders' private lives has not even achieved the one good one might expect: a deeper knowledge of those whose lives have been investigated. Because candidates are aware that the media treat them like arrested felons, anything you say can be used against you. Many confine themselves to banalities when speaking in the presence of journalists. They not inappropriately assume that it's safer to appear bland than to risk making a personal revelation or issuing a statement that could be cited out of context and used to damn them in the future. Finally, it's likely that such intrusive scrutiny discourages many Americans. Some with fine characters, from considering public service. How many among us, if nominated to a political position that would provoke our ideological opponents to ask everyone who has known us, "Tell us the worst thing you know about so-and-so, or the worst thing you have ever heard about him, and tell us the names of anybody you know who dislikes him, so we can speak to them," would willingly undergo such scrutiny, however moral our lives. Even journalists bent on exposing every public figure's fee of clay do not wish to sustain such an indignity. Some years ago, Paul Taylor, a Washington Post reporter, asked the straying presidential candidate referred to earlier whether he thought that adultery was immoral. And the candidate said yes. Taylor asked him if he had committed adultery. After a moment's stammering, the candidate responded, "I don't have to answer that." A few weeks later, after the man had withdrawn from the presidential campaign, People magazine posed to Taylor the same two questions he had addressed to the candidate. "Yes, I do consider adultery immoral," the journalist responded. "The answer to the second question is none of your business." In other words, even those who spread gossip don't want to be its victims. Indeed, many journalists routinely declare their own lives off limits, even when one could make a case that the public has a legitimate right to know about them. For example, journalists who cover the U.S. Congress or the White House seldom say what their political preferences are or which candidate they hope wins. Sometimes the newspapers that employ them do not permit them to be members of a political party or to vote in elections. But that doesn't prevent journalists from having political preferences. Cannot an argument be made that the public should have the right to know if someone reporting a scandal or other negative information about a candidate or nominee has personally favored, perhaps strongly favored, that candidate's opponent? Shouldn't the public the better assess whether the journalist similarly reports negative information about the candidate or party he or she favors? Perhaps the worst repercussion of attack journalism is that some decent people, precisely because they are more easily ashamed, have been and will be discouraged from entering the public arena. The late New York Times columnist Anthony Lewis argued, quite persuasively I think, that if we tell people there's to be absolutely nothing private left to them, then we will tend to attract to public office only those most brazen, least sensitive personalities. Surely such an outcome serves no moral good. The time has come to return to some of the civility that prevailed in the past. Part 3. How we speak to others, controlling rage and anger. Only God can give us credit for the angry words we did not speak. Rabbi Harold Kushner. The Bible almost always describes romantic love from the male's perspective. We are told that Isaac loved Rebekah, Jacob loved Rachel, and Samson, with far less happy results, loved Delilah. In the entire Bible, there is only one woman whose love for a man is recorded. Now Michal, daughter of King Saul, loved David. A short time later, when Michal's father, afraid that David will usurp the throne, plots to kill him, she helps David escape by lowering him from a window. Stephen confuses the hired assassins by placing a human image, topped with hair and dressed in clothes, in David's bed. By the time the would-be killers realize Michal's ruse, her beloved is far away. Although the Bible never reports that David reciprocated Michal's love, we do know that he risked his life in one-on-one battles with 200 Philistines to win Michal's hand in marriage. Later, when David spent years hiding from King Saul, Saul gave Michal, still David's wife, to a man named Phalt. Although many husbands would have repudiated a wife who had acquiesced to such an arrangement, when David became king, he restored Michal as his queen. Yet, despite the intense love at their relationship's outset, David and Michal's marriage becomes perhaps the saddest in the Bible. Within a few years, this once devoted couple are totally estranged. David and Michal both suffer from the same character flaw, sharp tongue, which each refuses to control when angry. The Bible describes the incident that triggers the end of their love.
Ironically, it happens at a celebration. David is supervising the return to Jerusalem of the Ark of the Lord, the holiest object in ancient Jewish life. The Ark, which contains the Ten Commandments, was captured by the Philistines many years earlier. In an outburst of joy, David dances passionately, even wildly, in front of thousands of his subjects. Watching the whole scene from palace window, Michal is disgusted by the spectacle of a monarch carrying on with such abandon. And so when David returned to the palace, she greets him with cold sarcasm. Didn't the king of Israel do himself honor today exposing himself, as one of the riffraff might expose himself? Are Michal's withering remarks justified? Has David truly acted in a manner that diminishes the dignity of his office? Perhaps, but whether or not Michal is right, her tactless criticism of her husband on this great day in his life blows a dispute into a gale-force fury. Michal's attack, however, is only the first factor in the tragedy that ensues. In the face of his wife's scorn, David does not remain silent, walk away until the tension eases, or even try to defend his behavior. Instead, he responds with the cruelest counterattack he can muster. It was before the Lord who chose me instead of your father and all his family that I danced. David's words in no way address the substance of Michal's critique. As many of us do when criticized, he goes straight for blood, attacking the most painful event in Michal's life, God's rejection of her father and his subsequent death, along with 3 of Michal's brothers, at the hands of the Philistines. In the very next verse, the Bible records, "So to her dying day Michal, daughter of Saul, had no children." Why is Michal's childlessness recorded at this point? Perhaps because after so brutal an exchange, and there might well have been others, Michal and David were never again intimate. The Bible's point is as clear today as it was in 1000 BC. If a husband or wife, or 2 siblings or friends, do not restrain their words when they are angry, love is unlikely to survive, no matter how deeply the 2 people once cared for each other. The ability to control what we say when we're angry is a prerequisite for a lasting relationship. Unfortunately, this piece of biblical wisdom flies in the face of much modern thinking. Today, many people believe that it's unhealthy to suppress rage. If you feel an emotion, it's considered important to express exactly what you're feeling. To which I ask, why? That you feel rage does not entitle you to inflict emotional pain on others any more than feelings of sexual attraction entitle you to harass the source of your more than feelings of sexual attraction entitle you to harass the source of your attraction. Some might argue that, unlike sexual harassment, rage is sometimes justifiable. And sometimes, though not often, it is. But then again, what angry person doesn't feel that his or her rage is justified? One of anger's insidious qualities is how easy it is to find 1,000 excuses for it. And while rage sometimes is justified, what other emotion should one feel toward an Adolf Eichmann or a Charles Manson? Many of us express rage not when it's justified, but when only far milder emotions are warranted. As the psychotherapist Bernie Ziegfeld has written, I cannot count the number of times that married couples tell me, I've got all this anger bottled up and I need to get it out. Sure you do, and I'll be happy to cater the divorce. Even when anger is justified, it is unfair, unjust, and hence morally wrong to express it in ways disproportionate to the provocation. So what if you find it painful to hold in your angry feelings? Isn't it morally preferable that you experience the pain of suppressing disproportionate or out of control anger rather than make the person with whom you're angry experience the pain of being on the receiving end? Rage is not only destructive, as in the case of David and Michal, but also self-destructive. The rabbis claim that when a wise man loses control of his temper, his wisdom deserts him. Thus, the Book of Numbers describes an episode in which Moses becomes outraged at the Israelites' incessant whining about water and pretty much about everything. God directs him to speak to a large rock, from which he will then send water to satisfy the people's thirst. But Moses, still furious at the Israelites' many years of complaining, disobeys God's command. Instead of speaking to the rock, Moses strikes it, saying, Listen, you rebels, shall we get water for you out of this rock? Many of us hit objects when we're angry. The Torah's point is profound. When angry, you should attempt to speak, not hit or burst out in rage. Furthermore, when we're angry, we are apt to make extreme and unwise comments. Thus, although Moses surely did not intend it, his use of we implies that it is he and his brother Aaron who is standing alongside him, not God, who are responsible for the miracle of the water gushing forth from the rock. That is a dangerously foolish comment, the kind we all make when angry, and it could have led the Israelites to believe that Moses himself was a god. Moses pays dearly for his loss of self-control. God denies him entry into the promised land. In addition to acting unwisely, we often appear foolish when we lose our temper. In his book Acting in Film, the actor Michael Caine recalls that I used to lose my temper. I would fly off the handle quite quickly in a work situation. Then worked on a picture called The Last Valley by James Clavell, who had been a prisoner of the Japanese during World War II. James looks like an Englishman, but he really thinks like Japanese. I lost my temper one day, and James just looked at me and let me finish ranting and raving, and then he said, Come with me, Mike. Let's go round the corner and sit down. Heat me down and talk to me about the Japanese theory of losing face. If you start to scream and shout, you look like a fool, and you feel like a fool, and you earn the disrespect of everyone. I've never lost my temper in a work situation again. A close friend of my wife, a man who has long struggled with his temper, once put it well, haven't you learned already that when you lose control of your temper, you look deranged, like a person taken over by animal rage? It is therefore important to control our rage, however righteous it may be. We may well have little control over what provokes our anger, but all of us, unless we are under the influence of mind-altering drugs, suffer some mental illness, or have certain types of brain damage, can almost always control how we express our anger. The psychologist Richard Gels tells of a marriage counselor who was interviewing a man who often physically abused his wife. Why do you beat up your wife? The counselor asked the husband. I can't control myself, the man responded. I just lose control. The counselor, being a very wise person, asked, Well, why don't you shoot her or stab her? The husband had no response to that because the only answer he could have given would be, I can't shoot or stab my wife, I might permanently hurt her. This man knew very well what he was doing. If you believe that you truly can't control your temper, imagine the following scenario. You're walking along the street late at night when you are suddenly confronted by a mugger with a knife or gun who demands your money. I think it can be safely assumed that there are few people whom you would hate more than this thug. Yet do you express your rage? Do you curse the person? Not at all. Chances are you treat the person very politely and offer all the cash you have. Of course, the only reason you do so is because you fear the person. But that is not the point. The point is that we can control our temper when we really want. To take another, less extreme example. You and another person, say a family member, are having a screaming, no-holds-barred fight when suddenly the doorbell rings. Someone whom you're very eager to impress, such as a boss or a new client, stands in front of your door. Would you go on ranting, or would you find a way to suppress your rage? Perhaps you would suppress your rage for a short while, for as long as it took until the visitor left, whereupon the fight would erupt again. But even if that until the visitor left, whereupon the fight would erupt again. But even if that happens, your ability to delay your rage means that you do have some control over your temper. Furthermore, the delay itself would probably lessen a light intensity. As the psychologist Carol Tavros cautions, expressing anger while you feel most angry nearly always makes you angrier. I would go a step further. I believe that most of us can control the expression of anger for far longer than a few minutes or even a fuse. Here's another, admittedly highly unlikely, scenario. Suppose you were told that if you cut back on screaming or otherwise speaking harshly and expressing anger at your spouse or children or friends or employees or all the preceding by 75% for 6 months, you would be given $2 million. Do you think you would find a way to control your temper?
I think most of us would become geniuses at learning how to control turn veer in truth. Almost every one of us has far more control over our rage than we are willing to acknowledge. For some, the control might be almost total, while for others it might be far less. People who have less control must recognize their moral obligation to curb their harsh words. If they find themselves incapable of doing so on their own, they are morally obligated to seek the sort of professional help that will enable them to exert greater self-control. Each year, large numbers of once loving relationships worth far more than $2 million are destroyed because of the hateful things people say when angry. To counter this, we must destroy the myth that Mikkel and David, and you and I, cannot control what we say or do. Dr. Stephen Marmer, a professor of psychiatry at the UCLA School of Medicine, recommends that in dealing with anger we think in terms of layers, cascades of control. 1. Control of our initial reaction. 2. Control of our initial response. 3. Control of our initial reaction to the other's response. 4. Control of our succeeding reactions. Moving down this list, the degree of control grows progressively greater. Thus, even if you have not controlled your initial response, you can exert greater control over your next response and work to repair any damage you might have caused earlier. Indeed, one of the saddest things about the David Mikkel story is that the Bible records no effort by either to repair the damage caused by their tactless and cruel words. Tactless and cruel words. This is not to say that it is always wrong to feel anger or to express it within ethical limits. When Maimonides, the preeminent medieval Jewish philosopher and rabbinic scholar, wrote on the need to control one's temper, he also warned that a person should not become so indifferent to what others do that he becomes like a corpse, totally incapable of feeling. Maimonides' cautionary words might well have been in response to the extreme strictures expressed by some Roman thinkers against ever expressing anger. Seneca, the first-century Stoic philosopher, argued that people could control their tempers no matter what the provocation. He cited the story of Harpagus, who, instead of going into a rage when a Persian king presented him with the heads and flesh of his own children, responded bloodlessly, "At the king's board, any kind of food is delightful." What Maimonides proposes instead is an emotional golden mean. A person should display anger only when the matter is serious enough to warrant it, in order to prevent the matter from recurring. In this regard, he might well have been influenced by the nuanced advice of Aristotle, of whom Maimonides was a lifelong student. It is a slavish nature that will submit to being insulted or let friends be insulted unresistingly. A person is praised who is angry for the right reasons, with the right people, and also in the right way, at the right time, and for the right length of time. Each of Aristotle's 5 conditions can help us guard against inappropriate expressions of anger. For the right reasons, we should not become angry over petty matters. With the right person, if we are angry at our boss, we should not come home and take it out on our spouse or children. Also, for example, at work, we should not get upset at our supervisor for implementing an unfair order from our mutual boss, in what is known in popular parlance as blaming the messenger, and in psychological terms as displacement, in the right way. Even when we are justifiably angry, we are still required to act fairly. If your anger is disproportionate to the provocation, then it is better not to express it at all, or to wait until you have calmed down before you speak of the matter. One way to assess whether your anger is excessive is to ask yourself, and this requires self-discipline, whether you still feel any concern or compassion for the person who has upset you. If the only emotion you can get in touch with rage, then your anger is, most probably, excessive. The appeal of the prophet Habakkuk, directed to God, contains a reminder that applies to all of us when angry. In your wrath, remember mercy. At the right time and for the right length of time. We shouldn't react immediately, unless we know we are calm. Right after something has enraged us, our anger may be out of control. It is better to wait until we are more composed. However, we also should not react long after the event has occurred, by which time the offending party may assume that all is normal and is shocked to learn that we have been harboring anger. Finally, we must learn to let go of our anger once we have expressed it. The cohesiveness of many families has been destroyed by members who hold on to their rage for years, or even decades. Aristotle's checklist is an important one for each of us to review when we are angry. Otherwise, we will not hold our anger in check, believing, even when we are wrong, that we are justified. The Catholic theologian St. Francis de Sales wrote that anger is nourished by 1,000 false pretexts. There never was an angry man who thought his anger unjust. If you've ever ruptured a close relationship with angry words, consider whether observing the following rule could have led to a different outcome. Limit the expression of your anger to the incident that provoked it. Focusing the discussion in this way avoid making the criticized party feel that his or her whole being is being attacked. Is this principle that David violated in his cruel counterattack after Michal mocked his dancing? He could have responded in many different ways. I was overcome with joy, and I didn't want to rein in my dancing. I made myself more, not less, beloved in the eyes of the people by showing them that I am a creature of flesh and blood just like them. He could even have spoken more sharply. You are the one who acted like a cold aristocrat, Michal, by behaving indifferently on so great a day. However, what David did wrong was to attack Michal, her point of greatest vulnerability. It was before the Lord who chose me instead of your father and all his family that I danced. These words, by alluding to the most tragic event in Michal's life, were calculated to humiliate and devastate his wife. They were the equivalent of responding to a slap in the face with a shot to the heart. Unfortunately, many people act as David did. In Somerset Maughams of Human Bondage, the protagonist, Philip, has a clubfoot. One reason for Philip's generally low estimation of human nature is the realization that when his fellows were angry with him, they never failed to taunt him with his deformity. We all have club feet. For Michal, it was the pain of her father's rejection by God. For someone else, it could be a weight problem, or a lack of professional success, or an unhappy love life. To bring another person's vulnerability into an argument is wrong. Absolutely wrong. If you ever become tempted to attack someone where he or she is most vulnerable, stop yourself from doing it as surely as you would stop yourself from punching a friend at whom you were upset. The worst time possible to allude to painful areas in another person's life is during a fight. You are likely to be much harsher, and the other person far less receptive, if he thinks your comments are part of an attack. If sore points must be discussed, do so when you are feeling love for the person, not animosity. Had David and Michal abided by this rule, they could have fought about the issue that provoked their anger, but their dignity, and hence their relationship, could have remained intact. Yet another reason words said when we are angry can cause such hurt and alienation is that people generally assume that what we say when we are angry is what we truly feel. And it is what we truly feel. At that moment, when we are angry, we often feel and think unfairly. Few of us would want our parents, spouses, children, or friends to know every angry thought about them that goes through our heads. That is why many of us choose to keep such thoughts. But once we release these often distorted thoughts into the world, others tend to assume they represent our true feelings, not just our thoughts during those moments of rage. Therefore, we should be guided by the words of Solomon ibn Gabriel, the 11th century Spanish Jewish philosopher and poet. I can retract what I did not say, but I cannot retract what I have already said. The one place where it is appropriate to express your anger, a therapist's office, is exactly where you should say whatever you are feeling. Expressing your deepest anger will enable both you and the therapist to come to a better understanding of your needs and fears, and may help you devise ways to exert better self-control. Because of the therapist's obligation to not transmit anything you say to anyone else except in the rarest life-threatening circumstances, you need not be concerned that your possibly disproportionate and unfair comments will become known to the people with whom you are angry. The flip side of expressing disproportionate anger is not expressing it at all. Many of us, when emotionally hurt, tend to withdraw from the person who has hurt us rather than address the issue. This withdrawal violates the following biblical injunction: do not hate your brother in your heart. When we learned this law as Yeshiva students, my classmates and I found it unintentionally amusing. Does that mean, one boy challenged our teacher, that it's all right to hate somebody as long as you tell them to their face?